Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. Donald Trump is once again at the center of a rapidly escalating Middle East crisis. But if you listen carefully to what is actually being said in Washington, Tel Aviv, and Tehran, a very different picture emerges from the surface-level headlines. This is not a story about a president who is simply preparing for war with Iran. And it is also not a story about de-escalation or restraint in the traditional diplomatic sense. What we are seeing instead is something far more calculated, and in many ways far more unsettling, a strategy built around controlled pressure, partial destruction, financial suffocation, and carefully managed escalation, all designed not to destroy Iran outright, but to reshape its behavior under extreme constraint. At first glance, that may sound contradictory. If the United States has the military and economic capability to cripple Iran, why not finish the job? Why not eliminate the nuclear program entirely, collapse the current regime's operational capacity, and reset the regional balance once and for all? The answer, at least from the logic presented in this policy direction, is not about capability. It is about cost, consequences, and control, because, in modern geopolitics, destroying a state is often easier than managing what comes after. And that is where the real strategy begins. In recent statements and briefings, senior U.S. defense officials have made something very clear. The United States is fully capable of striking Iran's energy infrastructure, dismantling its electrical grid, and targeting its industrial base. Military assets are positioned, intelligence is active, and strike options are on the table. But at the same time, those same officials repeatedly emphasize something else. Restraint is still the preferred path, not because Iran is untouchable, but because full-scale destruction is not the objective. Instead, the operational model being described is a layered pressure system. First, there is the maritime dimension. The U.S. has moved to enforce what is being described as a naval containment operation. Around Iranian ports, commercial shipping tied to Iranian logistics is being intercepted, inspected, and in some cases detained. This is not a symbolic gesture. It is a direct attempt to choke the flow of energy exports and imported goods. Second, there is the financial dimension. The Treasury Department has signaled what it calls economic actions equivalent to military force. This includes secondary sanctions aimed at any entity that continues to purchase Iranian oil or facilitate Iranian banking access. In other words, Iran is not just being isolated, it is being structurally disconnected from global financial circulation. And third, there is the military deterrence layer. U.S. forces remain on standby for escalation. Strike capabilities are deployed across the region, and officials have made it clear that targets inside Iran's energy and infrastructure network are already identified. But here is the key point. None of this has yet transitioned into full-scale war. Instead, it sits in a deliberately maintained gray zone between peace and war, where pressure is maximized but collapse is not immediately triggered. And this is where Donald Trump's strategic logic becomes central. Trump, according to his own public remarks, repeatedly emphasizes two parallel ideas. First, that Iran is under extreme pressure and will eventually seek a deal. And second, that a negotiated settlement is preferable to total destruction. He has stated directly that there are two possible paths: a military escalation that inflicts severe damage and then winds down, or a diplomatic agreement that ends the conflict and allows reconstruction. But he also signals a preference: the deal is better. Not because he is avoiding confrontation, but because he understands something fundamental about modern warfare between major regional powers. Destroying Iran does not end the problem. It transforms it. A collapsed Iranian state would not simply disappear from the strategic equation. It would likely fragment internally, destabilize the region further, and create long-term security burdens for the United States and its allies. It would also generate unpredictable energy shocks in global oil markets, something no U.S. administration can ignore. So instead of pursuing total collapse, the strategy appears to be something closer to controlled degradation. This is where the naval blockade logic becomes important. The U.S. military leadership has described it not as an attempt to destroy Iran's maritime capacity, but to regulate it. Shipping is being stopped, redirected, or inspected, but not entirely annihilated. The objective is pressure, not total elimination. One senior defense briefing even framed it as the most restrained version of escalation available, which is a revealing phrase in itself, because it implies that more extreme options exist but are being deliberately held back. And that raises the core question, held back for what purpose? The answer appears to be negotiation leverage. Iran is being placed in a position where its economic survival, export capacity, and internal stability are all under increasing stress. At the same time, it is being offered an off-ramp, a potential agreement that could include sanctions relief, partial reintegration into global markets, and a pause in military pressure. This is pressure designed to force decision-making, not destruction for its own sake. In this framework, war is not the goal. Compliance is, and that distinction matters, because when you listen to the rhetoric coming from U.S. defense officials, it is filled with dual messaging. On one hand, there is overwhelming confidence in military superiority. Statements emphasize intelligence dominance, precision targeting capability, and full awareness of Iranian military infrastructure. On the other hand, there is repeated emphasis on choice. Iran is told it still has a future, that it can choose prosperity, and that escalation is avoidable. This dual structure, maximum pressure, combined with conditional optimism, is not accidental. It is a psychological strategy as much as a military one. It is designed to create a perception inside Tehran that time is not on their side, and that resistance will only lead to deeper degradation. But there is another layer to this that is often overlooked, because while Washington is applying pressure, it is also carefully avoiding irreversible commitments. Even the maritime blockade, as described in official briefings, is structured in a limited way. It applies to vessels connected to Iranian ports and logistics chains, but does not fully close critical global shipping routes. That distinction is important, because full closure would trigger immediate global economic consequences. Instead, what is being implemented is a targeted disruption system, enough to create economic pain, but not enough to collapse global trade stability. This is not total war. It is calibrated coercion, and that brings us back to the central question, why not go further? Why not eliminate Iran's nuclear program entirely through overwhelming force? Why not remove the threat permanently? The answer, again, is not technical, it is strategic. Because in the worldview being reflected here, the most dangerous outcome is not a partially intact Iran, it is a completely broken Iran. A broken Iran does not become neutral, it becomes unpredictable. It becomes fragmented. It becomes harder to control than a pressured but still functioning state. So the goal is not to erase Iran from the map of power. It is to reshape its behavior while keeping it structurally intact enough to remain manageable. That is the uncomfortable reality of modern coercive diplomacy. Stability is sometimes achieved not through resolution, but through controlled instability. And this is why the rhetoric constantly oscillates between threat and negotiation. One moment, officials emphasize overwhelming military readiness. The next, they emphasize diplomacy and potential agreement. These are not contradictions. They are part of the same system. Pressure creates urgency. Diplomacy provides the exit. And both are necessary for the strategy to function. From Trump's perspective, this also aligns with his broader political identity. He consistently presents himself as someone who avoids long wars, avoids occupation scenarios, and prefers deal-making over prolonged military engagement. But that does not mean he avoids force. It means force is used as leverage rather than endpoint. In this case, Iran becomes not a battlefield to be occupied, but a system to be pressured into compliance. And that is why the naval blockade, financial sanctions, and targeted military readiness are all operating simultaneously. They are different tools serving the same objective, narrowing Iran's options until negotiation becomes the most rational path available. Of course, none of this guarantees success. Iranian leadership may choose resistance over compromise. Internal political dynamics may harden rather than soften under pressure, and escalation risks always remain embedded in this kind of strategy. But what is clear is that this is not a simple binary of war or peace. It is a continuum of pressure designed to produce a specific political outcome without triggering full-scale regional collapse. And that is why the original question, why not completely destroy Iran, misses the real structure of the strategy, because destruction is not the point, control is. And control, in this context, does not mean eliminating an adversary. It means shaping its available choices until only certain outcomes remain viable. Whether that approach ultimately succeeds or fails will depend on factors far beyond military capability. It will depend on endurance, political cohesion inside Iran, alliance coordination in the region, and the willingness of all parties to continue operating inside this high-pressure equilibrium without tipping into uncontrolled escalation. But for now, what is unfolding is not a final war. It is something more calculated, more restrained, and arguably more complex. A system of pressure designed not to end a state, but to force it into a narrower version of itself, one that fits within the strategic boundaries defined by power, deterrence, and negotiation. And that is why, despite all the military language, all the talk of readiness, and all the visible escalation, the ultimate objective still circles back to a single point, not destruction, but a deal. Thanks for watching.